All right, well, while the rest of the team sit down, I'm going to throw another stat at you. I know I overwhelmed you guys with some stats yesterday, and Corey cited a couple. But here's one that I think frames the discussion here today really well. So J. Walter Thompson did a study back in the late 70s that estimated the average American consumer was exposed to 500 brand impressions a day, so 3 figures. The last time I was able to get data on that is like a decade ago. It was a Nielsen study that estimated the average American consumer was exposed to 12,000 brand impressions in a day. I think that number is low, but we've gone from 3 figures to at least 5 figures. So yes, we have fragmentation of media, atomization of media. We have fragmentation and atomization of brands competing in the marketplace from a couple of hundred back in those days to 12 million plus, depending on how you define these things. But the consumer is the one that's really being besieged. We're all consumers. We all know what we see. We'll get into some discussions about cognition versus unconscious things maybe, but we're really here today to talk about this movement towards attention metrics and this tension with the way Steve described this panel as engagement. So just one last anecdote. When I first started covering the business in 1982 for Adweek magazine, one of the first things I covered was a new form of attention measurement. It was called television audience assessment, and the industry was really big on it because for the first time it was breaking down which programming held a consumer's attention more than the next. It wasn't TV ratings, it was, and I won't go into the methodology. The methods have improved a lot. Technology's improved a lot, and you're going to hear some of that today. But I'd like to start off by asking the panel to introduce themselves briefly, but basically help level set what we're talking about here in terms of the definitions of the words attention, engagement, and any other proxy words you think we're really talking about. And what do they mean to you and your organization, and how are you applying it in terms of media planning and buying specifically? So we'll just do it linear because I don't know another way to do it unless anybody wants to. Okay, so Sid.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, I'm Sid. I lead comms planning for Wpromote. I think, like you said, there's a lot of impressions that we're being served. Also, I read a recent study that said we consume 34 gigabytes of information every day. So when we think about attention versus engagement, we were talking about, well, attention is great, but we need to really define the word engagement because sometimes it's important to know, are we talking about an audience that's engaged with content, or are we talking about engagement in media terms, which is likes, clicks, conversations that we have with the brand? At Wpromote, we really kind of lean into delivering performance. So when we talk about engagement, it kind of we think about moving upstream as well. And really creating a clear distinction between the two, because it's not a versus, but it's a yes and to that. So yeah, thank you.
Megan?
Hi, I'm Megan Jones. I'm Chief Media Officer at Digitas. It was funny, we were in prep, we were talking about how the three of us tend to agree on a lot of things versus giving you guys some tension from stage today.
No drama.
No drama. We'll see. So from my perspective, attention for a little bit was sort of like the new thing we all wanted to talk about, right? It was like viewability, okay, we don't care as much about that anymore. Is attention in some ways a replacement for awareness? I would say in some cases yes, in some cases no. Within the walls of Digitas, we talk about it a lot as a proxy for impact. Have you had impact with whatever consumer audience you're trying to engage? And agree with Sid, it's not attention is more valuable than engagement. It's not attention is the only thing we care about, and we no longer care about engagement. It's the two being used in partnership with one another. And I actually would argue attention to me is valuable across the entire ecosystem. I don't really believe in the funnel being dead or broken. I believe it's just become fluid. And so thinking about where we can actually garner the best attention at different stages of a relationship someone has with the brand is a conversation we have a lot at the agency. And honestly, it had to start with an education session. So a year ago, we did an attention summit to make sure that everyone within the walls was talking about attention from the same perspective and understanding where it fit in the overall ecosystem.
And I'm Prerna. I lead investment at Crossmedia. As Megan said, generally agree with a lot of what Sid and Megan have said here. I think broadly, when we talk about attention, the other aspect around it, of course it correlates with engagement, but the way to think about engagement too can be misleading sometimes, because engagement with where you're like reading a lot of content and really immersed is very different from commenting on a social media post, and that doesn't always result in action either. So it is important to define those things, and how we like to think of it at our agency and how we talk about it more is really memorability, and even resonance was a term that we've talked about, because how can you make sure that what you're doing has that broader impact? Yesterday on some of the panels, there was conversation about having that larger brand equity versus someone just going and maybe buying a product but then not remembering the brand. And I think that's where the conversation of attention and engagement should really focus more on that brand equity, because that's what's really going to drive that larger focus and in terms of results as well.
So I heard it's not an either-or prop, it's along a spectrum. You have little nuances on how you define these things, but attention seems to be a table stake, you know. By the way, I do have one more stat I did while I was sitting at the table. I did index Google News coverage citations for the past year on some keywords, and attention metrics had 143,000 hits, and engagement metrics had 109,000. So attention's winning a little bit. I won't tell you how that compares to retail media and AI, but it's geometric. Anyway, what would be really instructive, I think, is if you guys could talk a little bit about the tools, how explicitly how you're using this to plan and buy and generate insights. And I think, Sid, you have something, if we can key up the slides, or do I need to use the... There we go.
So what you're looking at is us trying to solve for the conversation we are having, which is attention and engagement. Now, we are a preferred partner with Snap, and so we are doing this study where we've shared with them thousands of creatives from our campaigns across like hundreds of campaigns. And Snap being a platform that leans towards engagement, so you know, you have filters, you have haptic feedback, and what we're trying to do is measure how the campaigns perform across a spectrum, from upper funnel engagement to lower funnel delivery. What we're doing with that is we're taking all of that data and partnering with Lumen to try and triangulate the role of attention in that conversation. So while the results are not out, and so this is a sneak preview of where this is going, if you want to follow the results, follow us on Instagram and on LinkedIn. But that's what we're trying to solve for. And like preliminary results, what we're seeing is that when you engage with something, that means you're leaned in, and that's leading to a lot of brand metrics. So brand awareness, brand memorability, and all of these upper funnel metrics, something that even Prerna was talking about earlier. We're already seeing that come through. So that's exciting as a proxy for how we want to look at social media, TV in general. But you know, a lot more exciting news to come on this front.
I don't know. You have a quick response.
This was a quick study we did where we compared two interesting attributes, which is we identified seconds viewed per dollar spent and compared that with spot length viewed. And an interesting observation that came out of it is social is a lot more efficient. So the seconds viewed per dollar spent is higher on social. But what we saw was the spot length viewed was higher on TV, CTV, et cetera. So it went back to the objective. Like if you have an objective of trying to tell your brand story, then efficiency might not be the answer, but you have to lean into like broader environments. So we keep kind of thinking about the role of attention and engagement. And so this was a nice, interesting perspective of how do we think about it being an agency that thinks full funnel.
Thank you. Megan, I know you're working a lot with Adelaide, and can you describe how you work with them and any other tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, It's interesting. I was talking to the teams across the agency in prep for this conversation, and right now there are, I can count on one hand, clients that are wholeheartedly into the idea of attention, and it is measured across every campaign that they're doing. It's a key metric that they're focused on. For everyone else right now, it's more about testing and testing on individual campaigns. And I think part of that has to do with just the pace at which attention has gained traction. The fact that IAB and MRC are now talking about more standards in the marketplace, the fact that it is becoming more consistent across channels and coming more consistent to a degree across partners that measure attention. I think right now in the industry, we are talking a lot about it more than we actually have the stuff to actually do it on a regular basis. So I would say across our teams, they're actually using it as one diagnostic. It's not necessarily what they use as their key performance metric when they're planning new campaigns. It's sort of one among many others. I think increasingly, yesterday we talked a lot about MMM, increasingly how attention will be introduced into the MMM equation, I think will be important. And to us, it'll, again, just be one input, but there's no sort of single way that we're approaching it across every single client. And the other piece, and I'd be curious for the brands here, clients still at times think of it as a soft metric. And so getting them to understand the value of it for their specific brand and ultimately what outcomes they're trying to drive has been a marathon, I would say, that we're doing. I mean, a marathon we've been running maybe just for a year, but that to me is also kind of a key point we're going to have to overcome in the year ahead.
And Prerna, any specific tools and insights you can share?
Yeah, we've similarly also worked with Adelaide on a few brands, and it started off as a test and then escalated into more of something that's always on. And I think we've seen some success with it in how we can then take that to optimize some of our campaigns. But what we look at is not attention alone, but how it correlates with brand impact. So we've run, we've understood, are these channels driving brand impact and are they also driving attention? And when we're seeing that broader correlation, it helps reinforce that this is telling the same story and what we're expecting, that then allows us to make decisions to optimize. So we even see within like TV, for example, if certain networks and day parts are better, or on digital, if certain channels, of course, we'd expect CTV and video would have higher attention than display. But going into those a little bit more helps us think about how we optimize. And broadly, we're also having those conversations around how we can now take what we're doing within that particular brand to then inform MMM studies and how that can help enhance how we look at MMM results as a whole. So it's a journey for sure, and there are some clients that aren't bought in, and there's some clients that, of course it's viewed as another cost. We're already paying for brand safety and viewability, and now there's MFA also that we have to add avoidances and additional fees on fees, and so it is one of those things that kind of becomes a little bit more of a discussion, but certainly as the MRC, as Megan was saying, I think those things are adding more credibility to allow for the expansion of the conversation and to think of it more as one indicator along with many others.
I'm going to coin a new acronym right now, which is ROA, Return on Advertising Attention. But what I heard from you guys is it does kind of fall on a spectrum, but right now we're more in the benchmarking, baselining, insights, but I'm also hearing a little bit of optimization, which sounds to me like it's affecting the mix. So it is adjusting media schedules.
Yeah, exactly. That's on one of our brands, but it's a good, interesting development that we've started to do. We haven't integrated it necessarily into auto optimization yet, although that is certainly newer capabilities that keep building, but we're doing it more in increments. But the optimization is also driven by other factors, not just attention, but attention certainly is helping, is interesting to look at along with the others.
Yeah, we just got a press release today. I didn't get a chance to report on it, from Adelaide and OneTag, where they're integrating their data so it can just be seamlessly implemented in programmatic buys. So this leads to the important question, which is this transaction ready? Can you buy on this and post? Is it a currency?
There are a couple of interesting examples. Might not be like linear, but for example, Brave, the browser, transacts on attention, what I like about that is it involves consumers in that conversation where consumers are incentivized to share their attention with us. Then Google also introduced attention as a part of its bidding algorithm where you can now understand what's the size of the player that your ad will be served on. So it kind of gives you a sense of, you know, if you want to tell a big story versus just a lot more tactical as a campaign. Added to that is audibility on whether, you know, it'll be a sound on or a sound off environment. So all of these metrics feel like it's being used to transact, but, you know, not as a marketplace. Also, one of the challenges of transaction is attention is really special, but what we are doing is we are commoditizing it by calling it transactable. Yeah. And so that's where we all kind of falter in a way, where impressions, clicks are all actions, like clicks and whatnot, but this is something a lot more subtle, like we said, you know, and I think we need to be careful on how much transactable we want to make it as an industry.
Any other views on, no, not ready for prime time? No pun intended. But it sounds from your perspective, Sid, like it's part of an evolution or progression. We've always had financial incentives baked into the ecosystem based on the ability to garner attention, whether it's Google or, you know, I even think Adelaide has bonus weight applied if your ad holds the users more. Okay. Something that's important to me is if it is something people think will evolve into a currency, we need to understand, like, the validity of this data. I mean, we now are launching so many new alternative currencies. We just reported today at MediaPost that for TV metrics, an alternative currency, Video Amp, has already booked over $1 billion in guaranteed media buys for this new year. They plan to be $1.5 billion worth of. It's not even an MRC audited currency accredited. It is JIC audited and certified. But, you know, if we start, do you think we'll get to the point where one or more of these attention metrics will be a bona fide currency that you trade off of? I know we're not ready for it now, but do you think that'll happen, or will it always be a planning, maybe a mixed modeling concept, data input, but where do you think it's going?
I mean, I would say it probably will be something folks will transact on in a more meaningful way. But I think it has to hit a scaled point where it's possible to do that across multiple channels, a number of partners, a number of clients, right? Like, it sounds silly to say, but to introduce something in pockets is a lot of work for the industry to do. It's a lot of work for planning and buying teams. It's a lot of work for partners. It's a lot of work for clients. And so until you can kind of hit that critical mass, I don't see us choosing to transact based on attention. I think it needs to have a more scaled presence for us to go that direction.
And I love that point, because thinking of scale, you think about global scale. The way we measure attention, you know, eye tracking and heat maps and whatnot. If you think about the way people read, like Arabic is read from right to left. Japanese is read from top to bottom. So if you think about scaling global measurement metrics or the way we do, it's like a whole technology overhaul. So the cost of technology is something that can only be borne by, like, let's say a Google or a Meta for it to be scalable globally. Yeah. So yeah, that's another challenge for sure.
Yeah, and I would add, on top of everything, given all the fragmentation that even you just talked about in terms of so many measurement solutions and opportunities, I think until it reaches that broader point where it's more acceptable, I don't see it being the, you know, as common to transact on. But I think it will inform, and as it evolves, more informed planning. I think that's where it'll probably play more of a role, because that's where we've adopted it more, but of course can't predict the future, but I think that's where it seems to be headed right now.
How important is that we start to standardize what the methodologies and components of these measurements are? I mean, in the TV world, we have a lot of alternative currency, but they're based on the same basic framework now of big data associated with some enumeration or panel or something. These are very different methodologies. I mean, from my understanding, Adelaide's based on a heuristics model, kind of an evolution of Moat. Lumen's a panel-based thing. We've got neuromarketing, biometrics, eye gazing, all kinds of technologies here. Do we need an industry consensus and standards for this?
I agree. I feel like we are all mapping the brain from different perspectives. And also, like a watch out for us is as an industry, we kind of grapple with privacy as a challenge. We got to be cautious of how deep in the brain do we want to go and standardize that. Like it's already like a concept from Black Mirror, right? Where so in the interest of standardization, we got to walk that fine line of how far do we go on standardization. So yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the most acceptable aspects of measuring attention right now are methods that have been used for creative testing for years and years, decades and decades, right? When you get into neuro or biometric, that starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, but for now it's still opt-in. So technically speaking, that is still privacy compliant. I think our industry is always going to be pushing to be on the cutting edge, to have something that is more definitive than the thing before, that is more like, truly do I know that people's eyes were glued on the ad that I'm showing them? So I think that's always going to be where the push is, but I don't actually think that's going to be doable or scalable the way we would need it to be for it to be one kind of acceptable method. So I think we're gonna fall in that middle space in terms of how the measurement is actually going to happen.
Yeah, and I think also like adding another example to that list of how everything in the mind is being mapped is also like realize where they can see facial expressions as well. Like that's another one too. So adding onto those layers certainly opens up that can of worms with privacy. I think there will be that push and pull of we'll try to innovate, but also knowing how much scrutiny there is today on regulation. It'll have to balance together and work together. And it may, this is kind of why also I was leaning towards more on the planning side a lot, because I think planning is very different from when you're actually targeting and going after a particular audience. So as you're assessing creative, et cetera, that's where it can play that bigger role, but certainly there will be activation components as well.
And as you were kind of saying this, it kind of made me think that in terms of scaling it, that's where AI might step in as a more human-friendly way of scaling our understanding of how we respond. So while we don't have that now, that could be an interesting possibility.
Super powerful. A lot of implications. I think it's interesting we're touching on the ethics issue here, because I believe we will be having panel discussions on the ethical use of attention measurement to gain people's attention. You know, we just reported today that the House is now marking up the Kids Online Safety Act. You know, I don't know how you make this stuff COPA compliant, but you know, I think we should turn it over to see if there are any audience questions before I dive into privacy and ethics. Any?
Oh, I do have one question for you, because I think it's this. I mentioned at the beginning that the attention topic is a really, really interesting one. But it's hard because of these three factors, I think. And it's a media metric, but how do you balance the attention of the channel versus the content? And does the creative actually influence the ability to generate attention?
We talked about that a lot in our prep. And I think this is a topic that the three of us, and I would say you are too, right, are pretty bullish on. Right now, the onus feels like it's on the media folks, but if you give me a crap ad, like
no one's going to pay attention.
Right, like why am I taking responsibility for that? I mean, to me, that's no different than I think the conversations we always have with our creative partners to make sure that they're understanding sort of the context that the ads are going to be in, the experience that somebody is expecting in that space, and ultimately what a brand has permission to do in that space. So I think I can speak for the three of us, is like we all think that that's an incredibly important part of this conversation that historically is not actively a part of it, right? So having creatives and media folks talking about it in tandem is really important, because I can buy the most highly likely to garner attention ad space, but if the ad I put in it doesn't do what it needs to, then it's not going to perform.
And what about the channel versus the content of the channel? I mean, you can say that watching a show on NBC, there are shows that are better than others, have more attention. How do you factor that into the measurement?
I have a really good example, just as a gamer myself. We talk about channels, like let's talk about gaming and esports, for example. When you think about you're watching your favorite streamer play your game, you're talking about high rates of engagement, where an audience is like really glued to the situation, what's unfolding in front of him. And that's when an ad interjects that, and the game becomes like a small screen, and the ad kind of becomes the bigger screen. So the question is like, do you really want a hyper-engaged audience? So maybe you don't. And so that's where contextual understanding of where it's going to show up is super important to your question. And as esports starts to become a bigger part of our world, it's going to be a bigger conversation on how you interject at moments that were not planned. Like in Super Bowl, you have a halftime. But while gaming, where the game goes on for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you never know. So monetizing would be interesting.
And I think,
go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think coming back to the concept of memorability and resonance, that's where that creative really has that impact too, because it's even like the example we saw from AARP today, how relevant it was, how integrated it was into that channel, and how organic it felt. The experience matters more than just, so it really comes down to right place, right message, right time, all the same fundamentals.
Hi, Ryan David, Lean Media. Love this chart. It's really, I've been just staring at it. A couple of things popped up immediately. On the social side, yeah, that looks super efficient, but I'm wondering, is 90% of those seconds 3-second views of a 30-second spot? And is it misleading in terms of the actual overall value that those seconds are driving in terms of awareness and brand lift if they're only watching 5% of your spot on Meta? The other side of that is I'm sure Meta and TikTok look at a chart like that and go, hey, we're under monetizing our platforms. We should be able to charge more. We want our bars to be more like TV, which they're now doing. They're rolling out a lot more forced view ad types, and they're beta testing that a lot. I guess the biggest question, excuse me, is forced view versus opt-in. What are your latest thoughts on that? Even if they're not watching the full spot on social, if it's 7 seconds out of 15, would you still take that over a forced view 15-second spot, or is it still hit or miss, depends on the content, depends on the channel?
I think that's a really good question, because what this is devoid of, or at least like what this is kind of talking about, is audience action. Like if I have the ability to skip, I will skip. And so then we kind of talk about efficiency in that context. I do think, going back to the relevance and the ability to kind of create valuable content, if we all believe that attention is important and goes back to media and creative, then I think it is important that we apply that understanding to, let's say, CTV as well. I don't know if this is answering your question directly, but if we have the ability to kind of show up in places where the audience cannot take action, but has no choice but to listen to us, so we got to lean in from that perspective and create a valuable experience. I mean, we're all guilty of like not doing that really well, but that's a North Star for us, right?
Prerna, I liked your comment about planning, right? Using it for planning, because I think that makes a ton of sense. Because my controversial thought process to this is, if we go back to the late 90s when digital started, CTR was the best thing in the world, right? You couldn't measure clicks on TV. Look, I can measure something. Engagement almost feels like a sexier version of CTR, where it's more about correlation versus causation. What do you guys think about putting too much weight into engagement and not the outcomes that your actual creative planning, buying are getting you?
Yeah, no, 100%, and that's something we've definitely talked a lot about, because as we talk about attention, that alone is not, we can't give attention alone so much weight. It's really, the fundamentals are still the most important. It's the idea of brand equity. Are you building that brand? Are you driving performance? And those are the things that really need to be looked at. Attention can help enhance that or can help tweak, and you can correlate a lot of things with it, but it can't be the North Star that you base everything on. And that's why, as we have transacted, or as we've done measurement on attention, we've correlated that with that brand equity as well. And if we've seen that that is driving that same correlation that we're expecting, only then is where we're leaning in more into how it affects planning. But it's certainly a balance. I think it would be dangerous to go all in, because then you start to go down the rabbit holes that in the industry we're infamous for doing. So that's really important.
Yeah, I would say my build on that is I think all of us agree. I know at my agency we talk a lot about the media plan is designed to drive business outcomes. And then there are diagnostics that we look at that allow us to take action in real time. So some might be the KPIs and the metrics that we're using to optimize the media. Some of it might be what we need to report out on to help clients understand performance. But at the end of the day, the North Star remains kind of those bigger business outcomes that we're trying to drive. And to me, different measures of engagement, attention, awareness, et cetera, are all factors that we look at, but not kind of the sole focus.
It's interesting because that part of the conversation leads you back to the same thing we started yesterday with about brand versus performance, leading versus lagging indicators. And are you here to build a brand or are we here to build a business? Those two questions always seem to pop up for advertising. This side of the room is asking all the questions. You're very quiet. Any questions on that side? Joe?
Yes, I'm going to coin another acronym. It's called MAM, and it's Multi-Attention Attribution Modeling.
Yes, ma'am.
Because at some point, we're going to have to figure out how this all correlates to the outcome or the KPI. I'd like to turn it back, maybe close out with the ethics question, because I do think it's important. And also because I just saw the movie Dreams scenario with Nicolas Cage, where, they're actually inserting ads into dreams now, so. It's science fiction, but not too far out. Mindshare, who's not on this panel, has a neuro lab, and in it, one of the things they found about contextual, ad placement in media attention is like the best place to place an ad is right after a really scary moment in something. There's something about fear that opens our minds to a product persuasion. But is that good? Is that a good thing to scare the shit out of people and then serve them an ad? So I think these are the issues we have to deal with. And they're not just a media conversation. They are creative, branding, and societal and legal and privacy. Just to close out, do you think there's too much onus on the media component of this right now, and that maybe there needs to be an industry discussion about the role of attention metrics play in the greater, society of us?
I may not exactly answer your question, but to build a little bit on it, I think when you talk about creative as well, one of the things I remember, because when I worked at Ogilvy, it was I got to attend a summit where they talked a lot about the creative and how the role of the creative is really, the presenter talked a lot about how every ad should evoke some emotion, whatever emotion. It should be one emotion: funny, sad, happy, nostalgia, whatever it is. And that, I think, really stayed with me, because I think that goes well with your example of like that fear that it's inducing. So the creative does have a responsibility in what it's doing, and even those small 6-second ads, do they really garner the right, are they the right audience that you're going after at the end of the day? So it's thinking about how, are we gamifying it too much, or are we trying to be too provocative? Sometimes in the messaging is also important, which is where the media and the creative have to come together in terms of how we think about overall digital and where the industry is going in terms of those metrics. So a little bit of a tangent, but similar kind of a provocation of how important it is that we have to push the bar a little bit to get attention in this crazy space that we're in, but also how do we do it in a balanced way where it's authentic and not just doing it just for the sake of it.
Like emotion becomes a new metric even, right? Go beyond attention.
Can I follow up and extend Joe's question about how personalizable would attention metrics be? Because that really moves us into privacy questions. Can't an AI layer really be put on top of this, so we really are getting down to a very granular one-to-one level where we understand individual consumers' attention in relation to their media?
I think you need to ask the AI twins that question.
I feel like it's to what end and to what value, right? I think it's to some degree the same conversation we have about audience segmentation and how personalized and precise we actually want to be. Do we need millions and millions of variations of creative for each individual person we could potentially reach? And is that actually going to drive better business? To me, that's the constant conversation that I think media folks are having with creative partners and then with brands, right? If I could give, I adore my chief creative officer. If I could give him every canvas in the whole entire world to paint, he absolutely would take that opportunity. But that's not actually going to drive more business, right? So I think going back to this idea of what are the right emotions to play in, like I could see after Fear wanting to sell some alcohol or sell some candy. Like to me, that makes a ton of sense. But do I want somebody to be making a financial decision? Probably not. So like a financial services decision, right? So I think just understanding like as marketers, what our responsibility is, not media versus creative versus whatever else, but as marketers, what matters to the brands that we work with and where is it worth putting effort into because it's actually going to drive better business outcomes. If it's not going to do that and it just seems cool or it seems, you know, a new way to break through, but potentially piss off and interrupt, then I don't think it's worth our time and energy.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. It's almost like when you open the phone, behind the screen, you have hundreds of people who are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep you glued to the screen. It's like one versus a lot, and that's hard to win against. So when we go to ethics, and we know that there are certain people who are susceptible, who are who are like fighting this battle to kind of move away from the phone. It's our collective responsibility to watch out for them. So when we talk about attention, I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we don't prey upon the susceptible just because they are clicking more, just because they're buying more. I feel like that's an interesting outcome of ethical marketing that has a connection to the way we think about audiences and.
Well, that's where AI could be let loose and move itself and move targeting and buying towards such a granular level where it can make those exploitive decisions unless there are a lot of guardrails on it. Yeah. Even with cohorts, I mean, even if you're not doing it at a one-to-one level, even if you're just going to start using these tools to start identifying cohorts that are more responsive in particular circumstances, which certainly is something that AI could do.
But then that's where humans need to and should be interceding to help guide towards what actually is worth the time and energy and what makes sense from a consumer standpoint. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's perfect, because if you let the technology to the working and thinking, then Cambridge Analytica is a perfect example of what happens. When you take human values and thought process away, and you just let technology go after sparking the emotion. Because I think if you ask technology what will drive action, it's got to be emotion, and that's where humans need to interject and, you know, watch out for each other in that sense.
So by the way, I think we need to have a conversation about this at some point, because where you're going with where attention and engagement and all this is going to work out, as a media person, right, we know that if we could automate it, we will, right? If we can automate it within the bounds of ethics, we will. But there is still this concept of creativity creates attention. And whether it's in a bad show, a great piece of creative will capture attention. And one of the things that was being talked about a minute ago was this idea of interruption versus attention. Because we do live in a world right now where if you look at search and video, the two biggest portions of the overall spend for a marketer anymore. And I would argue TV is and video is going to surpass spend on search very, very quickly, very soon. Video lives in a world where it's based on an interruptive model. Only good creative, even with a 5-second skip button sitting there waiting for you, good creative will make you not skip it. And if that model is going to continue to exist, we have to actually still figure out how the creative gets better and better. And you can't automate the build of creative. You can automate some of the back-end work on it, but you still can't automate the building of great creative. So I do think that there's an interesting element there for a future panel to talk about how the AI tools on the media planning buying component are going to be in contradiction to the AI tools for creative, and which ones are actually going to come to the forefront as being most important to drive attention.
Yeah, like one of the things we talked about was when it comes to media and creative, like attention is an input, and for creative, attention is the output. So there is that tension where the two teams are looking at things differently. And if everyone looks at attention as an input, then it's going to be different.
So we did get some tension.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is attention.
All right. Joe?
Well, I predict the EU will pass new regulations evolving right to be forgotten to right to be ignored, because the technology is going to get us there. Anyway, if you need their attention, they'll be here for the next 24 hours or so. So thank you.